station known as Silent Halo had processed thousands of arrivals without incident, and it took quiet pride in that record. Suspended above a dim gas giant, its ringed structure reflected cold light across the void, a place designed for neutrality, order, and predictability. Nothing unexpected was supposed to happen here. Administrator Tarivilian had been awake far longer than recommended, managing disputes, system errors, and the usual low-grade chaos that came with maintaining peace between species that barely trusted one another. By the time the human delegation requested a live reception instead of automated intake, Tarev was already prepared to dislike them. When the docking bay doors opened, the human ambassador stepped out with a calmness that felt almost deliberate. Kale Rachan moved with steady confidence, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. He did not scan for threats the way most visitors did. He simply observed, as if he expected the environment to make sense eventually. Tariv initiated the formal greeting, extending a lower limb with practiced precision. The human accepted it with surprising warmth, his grip steady, his expression forming that strange human gesture bearing teeth without hostility. It was disarming in a way Tarev did not appreciate. Before the exchange could settle into routine, a sharp metallic sound echoed from the adjacent corridor. Tarev's sensory frills tightened instantly. He recognized the pattern before the source even appeared. The juvenile had escaped again. Handalamira rushed into view, struggling to maintain control of a guide tether that was no longer being obeyed. At the other end moved Kara, Dravik cub, already large enough to unsettle most adult visitors, his midnight-scaled body low to the ground, silver eyes locked on to the new arrivals. Everything slowed in that moment. Tarev shifted his focus immediately toward the human. "Do not move," he said firmly. The juvenile is trained, but still unpredictable. But Kale did not step back. He didn't advance either. He simply watched the cub with open curiosity, as if he were observing something rare rather than dangerous. Care circled once, claws clicking softly against the metallic floor. His posture shifted subtle, but unmistakable. Curiosity was tipping into overload. Mira reached for the tether at exactly the wrong moment. The sudden movement crossed the cub's vision. An instinct overtook training in a single instant. Karalum, the impact was fast and violent. The cub collided with the human, jaws locking onto Kale's forearm. Blood appeared almost immediately against the fabric of the ambassador's sleeve. The dock erupted into motion alarms. Shouts, protocol cascading into emergency response, but at the center of it all, something didn't follow the pattern. Kale did not panic. He drew in a breath, steady despite the pain, and spoke in a calm, controlled voice. "Easy. You're okay." The words were not loud, but they cut through the chaos. And impossibly, the cub released him. Care stumbled back, shock overtaking aggression, his posture collapsing inward as if he had only just realized what he had done. The tension in the room shifted instantly, confusion replacing fear. Tariv moved forward, already calling for medical response, his mind racing through containment scenarios, diplomatic consequences, and system-wide alerts. This was how incidents escalated. This was how conflict began. But when he looked again, the human was not retreating. He was lowering himself to one knee. Not toward safety, toward the creature that had just bitten him. And for the first time since Silent Halo had been constructed, something happened that no protocol had prepared for. The situation did not escalate. It changed. The medical wing of Silent Halo had seen its share of injuries, but confusion was not usually one of the symptoms. Yet that was exactly what filled the room as Dr. Vaughn studied the human ambassador's arm with visible irritation. The puncture wounds were real. The damage had been immediate and significant, and yet, against every established expectation, the situation was stabilizing far faster than it should have been. "This should be worse," she said under her breath, adjusting the holographic scan hovering above Kale's forearm. "Dravik bite pressure alone is enough to fracture bone. Their saliva carries enzymatic agents designed to accelerate tissue breakdown. Be all models. You should be in systemic decline." Kale glanced at the display, then back at her with mild curiosity. So the official diagnosis is that I'm inconveniently functional. The official diagnosis, Vaughn replied sharply, is that your species is medically unreasonable. Nearby, Administrator Tarev remained silent, processing a different kind of problem entirely. The physical injury was already becoming secondary. The real complication was behavioral. Because nothing about the human's response aligned with known patterns, most species, when attacked, demanded separation, accountability, consequences. Kalerachon had done none of those things. Before Tarev could formalize a response, a quiet sound came from the entrance of the medical chamber. It was hesitant, almost reluctant. Kerr stood in the doorway. The cub's scales had faded to a dull, uneven tone. His posture low, movement slow and deliberate. Behind him, Handla Mira followed at a careful distance, clearly unsure whether to intervene or allow the moment to unfold. In the cub's grasp was a small piece of cloth cleaned, folded imperfectly, but handled with obvious care. "I've returned this," Kerr said, his translator rendering the words with slight distortion. "It had your blood?" The room stilled. Kale looked at the cloth, then at the cub, and something in his expression softened not with dismissal, but with recognition. "That was thoughtful," he said. Kale lowered himself further, almost pressing to the floor. "I am sorry," he added quietly. "I said it before, but it did not feel complete." Dr. Vaughn made a faint, disapproving sound. "This is not a social exchange. This is a containment scenario." Kale ignored her. Instead, he shifted slightly, careful of his injury, and extended his uninjured hand. He did not rush the movement. He let the cub see it, process it. Then, slowly, he placed his hand against the top ridge of Kerr's head. The contact was gentle, intentional, and completely outside protocol. Kerr froze at first, his body tense, uncertain. Then, gradually, that tension began to ease. His breathing slowed. The sharp edges of panic softened into something quieter, something that had no direct translation in any station manual. "You got scared," Kale said calmly. "You made a bad call." "That happens." Kerr's voice came out smaller this time. "I caused harm." "Yeah," Kale admitted. "You did, a boss. But you knew it right away. You came back. You tried to fix it. That matters more than the mistake." Tarev watched the exchange with growing disbelief. This was not negotiation. It was not authority. It was not even strategy. It was something far more difficult to categorize. Kerr's scales shifted slightly, a faint trace of color returning. "My kind does not receive this," he said slowly. "After era." Kale gave a small, tired smile. "Mine dos." Dr. Vong crossed her arms, clearly unconvinced. "You are reinforcing unstable behavior with emotional validation. This is not discipline." Kale glanced at her. "No," he said. "It's teaching." That distinction hung in the air longer than anyone expected. Because for the first time, the situation was no longer about a bite, or an injury, or even a policy violation. It was about the possibility that a creature classified as dangerous was not fixed in that definition. That response could shape outcome. That fear, if interrupted at the right moment, might not escalate into something irreversible. Tarev found himself stepping back, not physically, but conceptually evaluating assumptions he had never needed to question before. Silent Hala had always believed that safety came from control, but what he was witnessing now suggested something far more complicated. That safety might also come from understanding, and that was not something the station was designed to manage. It was something it would have to learn. By the time the formal review session was called, the incident had already spread across Silent Halo. In half a dozen conflicting versions, in some retellings, the human ambassador had nearly lost his arm. In others, he had somehow subdued a predator with nothing but eye contact. The truth, as Administrator Taravilian had witnessed it, was far more unsettling. It did not fit into any category the station relied on. The council chamber filled quickly. Representatives from multiple species assembled on their respective platforms, each bringing their own assumptions about danger, responsibility, and consequence. At the center stood Kale Rahajan, his injured arm now supported but no longer critical, his posture relaxed in a way that felt almost inappropriate given the circumstances. Beside him, at a careful distance, sat Care. The cub's body was low, controlled, every movement deliberate. He did not scan the room with predatory awareness. He kept his gaze down more often than not, as if aware of the attention and uncertain how to exist under it. Handler Mira remained close behind, prepared to intervene, though it was increasingly unclear what intervention would even mean now. Counselor Marin opened the session with formal precision, his voice steady, his tone neutral. This chamber convenes to assess the behavioral risk demonstrated during the docking incident and to determine appropriate classification response. His gaze shifted toward Kale. Ambassador Wren, do you confirm that the juvenile Dravik initiated physical aggression without provocation? Kale nodded once. Yes, and yet, Marin continued, you have declined to file grievance, request containment escalation, or pursue disciplinary action. Also, yes, a low murmur moved through the chamber. It was not disagreement. It was uncertainty. Marin studied him for a moment, before asking the question that mattered most. Kale did not rush the answer. He glanced briefly toward Care, then returned his attention to the council, because he knew he made a mistake the second it happened. He sighed simply. The translation carried the words clearly, and the effect was immediate. Care's posture shifted, just slightly. I did, the cub said quietly, before he could stop himself. I understood before the harm was finished. That admission traveled farther than intended. Several representatives leaned forward, their attention sharpening not at the incident, but at the response. Dr. Vaughn stepped forward next, projecting the medical analysis into the air above the chamber floor. The physical data does not align with expected outcomes, she said, her tone clipped with professional frustration. The ambassador's structure remained intact under bite pressure that should have caused fracture. Enzymatic response was present, but limited. Tissue stabilization occurred at an accelerated rate. She paused, then added with clear reluctance. In simple terms, the humans survived because humans are structurally more resilient than they appear. Kale raised an eyebrow slightly. I feel like I'm being evaluated. You are, Vaughn replied. Marin allowed the projection to fade, returning focus to the central issue. Biology aside, he said, the chamber requires clarification regarding your behavioral decision. Why respond to aggression with reassurance? Kale exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, but as if organizing something that was obvious to him and difficult to translate to others. Because he wasn't trying to harm me, he said. He was overwhelmed. A ripple of reaction moved through the chamber. That distinction is not supported by outcome, one delegate replied sharply. The result was injury. Sure, Kale agreed, but outcome and intent aren't always the same thing. He shifted his stance slightly, careful of his arm, then continued. Where I come from, we deal with things that can hurt us all the time. Animals, environments, even people. If we treated every mistake like a permanent threat, we wouldn't have survived long enough to build anything. Another voice cut in. You are suggesting that a Category 5 predator can be corrected through social interaction. Kale gave a small, almost amused shake of his head. I'm saying you don't throw something away just because it scared you, he replied. You figure out why it reacted, and you teach it what to do next. The room fell quieter, not convinced, but listening. Marin turned his attention to Care. Juvenile, he said, state your current understanding of the incident. Care hesitated. Not out of confusion, but out of care. He was choosing his words. I acted before thinking. A sighed slowly. I felt too much at once and used my teeth instead of my voice. A pausa. That was incorrect. The translation rendered the simplicity of it with surprising weight. And what have you done since? Marin asked. Care drew in a controlled breath. I asked before moving closer, he said. I keep my mouth closed near others. If I feel too much, I speak first. Another pause, and if I cause harm, I return and attempt to repair it. Silence followed. Not because the chamber had nothing to say, but because it did not have a framework to process what it had just heard. This was not compliance under fear. It was understanding. Cale didn't interrupt. He didn't reinforce the statement. He simply stood there, allowing the cub's words to exist on their own, which Tarev realized might have been the most important part. After a moment, Marin spoke again, though his tone had shifted, less rigid, more measured. "This chamber recognizes behavioral adaptation," he said. "However, a single incident followed by corrective response does not establish long-term reliability." Kyle nodded. "That's fair." "And yet," Marin continued, "you're requesting continued interaction rather than separation." "I'm requesting a chance to prove that the change sticks," Cale replied. Another murmur moved through the chamber. Not resistance this time. Consideration. Tarev felt something unfamiliar settle into his analysis, a variable that could not be quantified through risk assessment alone. Because what he was witnessing was not a reduction of danger. It was a transformation of it. The session did not end with agreement. It ended with something more complicated, a provisional decision, supervised continuation, extended observation, and, most notably, a delay in final classification. As the chamber began to disperse, Tarev remained where he was, watching as Cale crouched slightly to speak to Carrot. Eye level. No Tori, no dominance, just quiet conversation, the kind that, until now, had never been considered relevant to station safety. For the first time, Tarev began to understand the true scale of the problem. If the human was correct, then Cylon Hollow was not just dealing with an incident. It was confronting an entirely different way of defining danger, and that meant everything built on the old definition would eventually have to change. In the days following the council session, Silent Halo attempted to return to its normal rhythm. Systems stabilized, schedules resumed, and official reports framed the incident as contained and under review. On the surface, nothing had changed, but beneath that structure, something subtle was shifting. Care remained under supervised movement status, which meant he was allowed in public areas only under observation and with clear spatial restrictions. The blue restraint harness marked him unmistakably as a risk, a visual reminder of classification that the station was not yet ready to release. Cale ignored the implication of it, where others saw limitation. He saw opportunity. Each day, in the quieter sections of the station most, often within the garden dome, he worked with a cub, using a method that was neither forceful nor passive. It was consistent, repetitive, patient in a way that seemed almost excessive. "Ask first," he would say. Whenever Care moved too quickly, mouth closed near people. Claws in when excited. Use words before instincts. It should have been ineffective. It should have failed against biology, against instinct, against everything the station believed about predator behavior. Instead, it worked. Not perfectly, not instantly, but undeniably. Care adapted not out of fear, but out of intent. He wanted to improve. That alone made him unpredictable in a way no system had accounted for. At first, the staff avoided them, then they began to watch. Quietly, carefully. Curiosity overcoming caution in small increments. They saw the moments that never made it into official reports. The cub stopping himself mid-motion, claws retracting where they once would have struck. The hesitation before action, the choice. And slowly, perception began to shift not through argument, but through observation. The turning point came without warning. The central promenade was a peak activity, a convergence of species, trade, and noise. Light reflected across polished surfaces. Voices overlapped in layered translation, and movement filled every available space. Cale was standing near a vendor stall, holding a small piece of human food that Care was attempting without much success to consume with restraint. That was when the overhead rail failed. The sound was sharp, metallic, wrong in a way that cut through the noise instantly. One of the suspended cargo trolleys jolted violently, its guidance locks disengaging in rapid succession. Below it, directly in its path, stood a small child too young to understand the danger, too frozen to react. The crowd moved, but not in the direction that mattered. By the time Tarif registered the trajectory, calculated the impact zone, and initiated emergency protocol, it was already too late for intervention through system control, but not for something else. Care moved first. There was no hesitation, no confusion, no uncontrolled reaction. He launched across the promenade with precise, directed force, not toward the falling structure, but toward the child. At the last possible moment, he adjusted his angle, lowered his center of mass, and struck with controlled impact just enough to displace, not harm. The child was thrown clear. The cub followed. The cargo trolley crashed down a fraction of a second later, shattering against the floor where they had stood. The sound was overwhelming. Glass, metal, and fragments scattered outward. Dust filled the air. Alarms activated instantly, flooding the space with emergency signals. Security drones deployed from the ceiling, their targeting systems engaging automatically, and every one of them locked onto the same target. Care froze. Not because of the drones, but because the child he had moved was now clinging to him, small, shaking, and very much alive. The cub lowered himself carefully, minimizing movement, his posture controlled despite the chaos surrounding him. "I moved too fast," he said, his voice strained but deliberate. "I attempted correction." Before the drones could escalate, Kale stepped forward, placing himself directly between the automated response and the cub. "Stand down," he said firmly. He just saved a life. The command cut through the overlapping protocols, just long enough for hesitation to take hold, long enough for context to catch up with reaction. The child's guardian arrived seconds later, pushing through the crowd, checking for injury, then turning toward Care with visible disbelief. The sequence did not align. The classification did not match the outcome. The child, still trembling, reached back toward the cub and held on to him. "Thank you." The translation came through softly. Care blinked once, processing. Then, in a voice far quieter than before, he answered, "You are safe." That moment spread faster than any official report ever could. Not the accident, not the damage, but the response. Witness accounts converged with unusual consistency. The juvenile had identified danger, acted with control, and prioritized protection over instinct. For the first time, the label assigned to him began to fracture under its own weight. Administrator Tarev stood at the edge of the scene, watching the aftermath unfold, aware that something irreversible had just occurred. Not because of the rescue itself, but because it had been seen, documented, shared. The system could ignore theory, it could debate interpretation, but it could not dismiss evidence. And what it had just witnessed was not a reduction in risk, it was proof of change. As the emergency teams secured the area and the crowd slowly stabilized, Kale knelt beside Kea once again, not as a handler, not as an authority, but as something the station still did not have a word for. "You did exactly right," he said. Kare's posture lowered slightly, tension releasing in small increments. "I chose differently," the cub said. Kale gave a small nod. "Yeah," he replied. "You did." And in that simple exchange, something far more significant than the incident itself became clear. This was no longer an experiment. It was a result. The aftermath of the promenade incident did not fade quietly. If anything, it intensified everything the station had been trying to contain. Silent Halo had protocols for accidents, for aggression, for system failure. What it did not have was a framework for what had just occurred: a classified predator, choosing restraint under pressure and acting with deliberate protection in a moment where instinct should have taken over. So the council did what it always did when certainty broke down. It convened another review. This time, the chamber was more crowded, not just with officials, but with observers, individuals who who had witnessed the event directly, or who had heard enough to question the conclusions they had once accepted without hesitation. At the center stood Kayla Rachon once again, his arm no longer bandaged, the injury reduced to a faint line that served more as memory than limitation. Beside him sat Care. No harness, no visible restraint, only a simple diplomatic collar marking his status as a juvenile under supervised development. That detail alone shifted the tone of the room. Counselor Marin opened the session with measured control, though even he seemed aware that the outcome would not follow standard procedure. This chamber acknowledges the events recorded during the promenade incident, he began. The juvenile Dravik demonstrated controlled response, situational awareness, and protective action toward a civilian. He paused briefly, then continued. The question before us is whether this reflects an isolated anomaly or a repeatable behavioral pattern. Kale did not wait to be prompted this time. It's a pattern, he said. A few delegates shifted immediately, but he continued before interruption could take hold. He made a mistake. He understood it. He adjusted, and when it mattered most, he chose correctly under pressure. That's not random. That's learned behavior. A representative from the upper tier responded sharply, or temporary conditioning under observation. Kale nodded once, then keep observing, he said. But don't ignore what you've already seen. The chamber fell into a more focused silence. Not resistant, ebalativi. Marin turned toward Care. Juvenile, he said. State your current understanding of your own behavior. Care straightened slightly, his posture still controlled, but no longer diminished. I have learned that fear is not instruction, aside slowly. That impulse is not decision. He paused, then continued. I have learned to ask before approaching, to use words before action, and to stop when I feel too much instead of acting through it. Another pause. And if harm occurs, I return to repair what I can. The clarity of it settled across the chamber in a way no argument had managed to achieve. This was not repetition. It was integration. A shift, not just in behavior, but in understanding. Before further debate could begin, movement at the chamber entrance drew attention. The child from the promenade incident entered with a guardian, guided carefully but without hesitation. The room adjusted around them instinctively. The child moved directly toward Care, without fear, without uncertainty, and placed both arms around the cub's neck in a simple, unfiltered gesture. He is safe, the child said. No translation error, no ambiguity, just a statement. That moment did more than any formal testimony, because it bypassed classification entirely. Moraine allowed the silence to hold before calling for final positions. The vote, when it came, was not unanimous, but it did not need to be. The result was decisive. The Category 5 hazard designation was suspended pending long-term developmental review. Movement restrictions were replaced with supervised cultural residency, and perhaps most significantly, the council approved a pilot program that would incorporate behavioral teaching models into future juvenile classification protocols. It was, in every measurable sense, a structural change, and it had begun with a single decision made in a moment of pain. As the chamber emptied, Administrator Tarev remained in place, watching as Kale and Care moved toward the exit together. There was no formality in the way they walked now. No visible boundary, only familiarity. You've changed the system, Tarev said as he approached. Kale considered that for a moment. I didn't change it, he replied. I just didn't follow it blindly. Kara shifted slightly beside him, leaning closer in a way that was no longer uncertain. I am staying with him, the cub said. Tarev's attention sharpened. That has not been formally established. It will be, Kalea said. And as it turned out, it was. The guardianship request moved through the system faster than expected, not because it was simple, but because resistance had lost its footing. Approval came with conditions, oversight, and more documentation than anyone involved wanted to process. But it came. Weeks later, the docking bay that had once been the site of incident became the point of departure. Silent Halo gathered not formally, but collectively to witness something it did not yet fully understand. Kara stood beside Kale at the base of the boarding ramp, fitted with a travel harness marked not with hazard classification, but with diplomatic recognition. He was larger now, more controlled. Not less dangerous, but no longer defined by it. Handalamira adjusted the final fastening, her movements slower than necessary. "Remember the guidelines," she said. "No, not it. Words before instincts. And if that fails, I ask for help." Kale gave a quiet nod at that. "Together," he said. "Together," Kay repeated. Administrator Terev stepped forward last, holding the finalized transfer slate. He had prepared several statements, formal acknowledgments, procedural summaries, carefully structured language that fit within the expectations of his role. He used none of them. "You made this system more difficult to define," he said instead. Kay blinked once, then gave a small, uncertain motion that might have been satisfaction. "That is acceptable," the cub replied. Kale almost laughed. The boarding calls sounded across the dock. They moved up the ramp slowly, not out of hesitation, but with awareness of what they were leaving behind. Halfway up, Kara paused and looked back. Not at the structure, at the people, at the place where he had made a mistake and been allowed to become more than it. "Kale," he said quietly, "do you think I will understand your world?" Kale shifted the travel bag on his shoulder and considered the question. "I think you'll understand enough," he said, "and the rest we'll figure out." Kale processed that, then gave a small nod. "That is acceptable," he sighed again. At the top of the ramp, he turned once more, then spoke clearly, his voice carrying across the dock. "I caused harm here," he said, "and I was taught how to stop. Apaus, I will remember." This time, the silence that followed was not uncertain. It was acknowledgement. The hatch sealed, the vessel detached, and as it moved away from Silent Halo, carrying both the human and the cub toward a future neither had fully defined, Administrator Tarev opened a new report. He did not begin with data. He began with a statement. That danger, when met only with control, remains danger. But when met with patience, structure, and understanding, it has the potential to become something else. Something the station had not been built to expect, but would no longer be able to ignore.